Hello everyone. So in this video we are going to discuss about the Kubernetes architecture. Okay. So what is Kubernetes architecture? It and what are the different components? We will quickly see it here. So first, it has two different components. One is called master node and another is called worker node. Master node, master node, and second one is called worker node. Okay, why it is not writing master node? Yeah, so there are two nodes, master node and worker node. Master node is also called as control plane, and worker node is also called as compute node, or people also say it sometimes like data plane. Okay, so this is the two important components we say in the Docker, in the Kubernetes. Now altogether this is called a cluster. What we can call it as a cluster. Okay, now let's deep dive into each component. First we will look into the master component. Okay, so let's draw this diagram here, make it little big. So in the master, the first component we have is called API server. Okay, then we have components called then we have two components called controller, and another component we have scheduler. Okay, there is one more component here. Okay, we will draw this diagram like this. There is one more component actually, let's say here, which communicates with the API server. Okay, so this is master node architecture. What we call this is called etcd. Okay, now we will understand each term, what etcd does, what is controller doing here, what is scheduler doing, and what is API server doing here. Okay, so let's understand this is a let's understand the another component. Let's write it first of all. This was a master node. Okay, and I will try to just give some color here so that it will be little good to distinguish. So component, scheduler, etcd, okay, and API server with some color again. Let's give these colors. Okay, so API master nodes have how many components? One is API, second is etcd, third is controller, and fourth is scheduler. So four main components here. Okay, now let's draw what is worker node and what are the different components in the worker node. Okay, so now let's draw the worker node, and let's give no color first. Then it will have a component called kubelet. Okay, and then kubelet, there is another component called kubeproxy. Okay, now kubelet will again have two different components here. Let's put towards inside the bracket, box. So this is called pod. Okay, this is also a pod. Okay, so what we also have to see is, when we are seeing this, in each cluster there will be one master node, but there can be multiple worker nodes. Okay, so this is the design. So master node, in one cluster there will be always one master node, and there will be multiple, there can be multiple worker nodes. Okay, like this. So in the current design we will just go with single node, so it will be easy to draw and understand as well. Okay, so how and what are these components and how this connection is happening? So what is kubelet, what is kube proxy, what are these pods? Okay, we will understand slowly. Now how is the connection is happening between the worker node and master node? So this was master node. Okay, so the connection between these two is happening using API server. Okay, so it's a two-way communication. So API server is responsible for the communication between worker node and master node, right? Now let's understand each and every term first of all, then we will club all these things, then it will be easy for our understanding. Okay, and as I told, it will be called altogether cluster. Okay, now let's say if any user has to communicate. Okay, if a user is there and he needs to communicate to this cluster, he will not be directly communicating to any of the master node or worker node. Oh sorry, this is worker node. So user will not directly communicate with the etcd controller, scheduler, kubelet or anything. So user will always first try to communicate with the API server. Okay, so user will only send the request to API server. So what does it means is API server is the front end used by the users, clients, tools, libraries with the Kubernetes. So inside the Kubernetes cluster, a user will always communicate using API server. Okay, he cannot communicate directly with etcd controller or scheduler. He will always send a request to API server. Now what is etcd? Okay, etcd is a kind of storage, you can say, or it is a kind of key value store that stores the value of desired state and current state. Okay, so if I draw a diagram like this, in this node, worker node, if I say there are one pod, in this one there is 2 pods, in this one there is 3 pod. Okay, so if we have to we have to increase the number of pods here, so etcd will have the storage. How it work, master node will get to know that this worker node, that is worker node maybe 1, 2 or 3, is having only one pod inside it. So that storage of that information will always be done inside the etcd. Okay, so etcd will store in each pod, okay, in each node how many pods are currently active. So in this pod, this worker node, you can see there are 2 pods, right? So that information is stored into the etcd. Now what is scheduler? Okay, scheduler finds a suitable worker node for newly created pods and service. Okay, if a new pod is getting created, so which node it has to go? Okay, so for example, which node it has to go, let me write for the easy understanding. It has okay, it has 2 pods, it has 1 pod, or let's say it also have a 2 pod, and this have a 1 pod. Okay, so this have a 1 pod, this is having 2 pods, this as well have two pods inside this worker node. So now etcd will have this information. Etcd will always have this information, which worker node have how many pods. Okay, but what scheduler does is scheduler finds a suitable worker node. Okay, so whenever a new pod is getting created, right, so it will immediately tell, okay, he will not go and deploy it, but it will tell the master node or API server that hey, there is node 3 which is having only one pod available. Okay, so scheduler will tell that node 3 will have only one pod available, and it is going to inform the API server. API server will store this into the etcd, right? Now etcd will say again, okay, I have stored it, and the request will go again back to the API server. Okay, now what is this controller is doing here? Okay, it is a control loop that watches the shared state of the cluster through API and make the changes attempting to move to the current state towards the desired state. Okay, so what it is doing is, so once the request will tell, okay, yes, etcd will tell, okay, I know that, okay, cluster number 3 or node number 3 have only one pod. So controller is now going to do, it will continuously keep on looking here, and it will go and increase the number of pod into the worker node. You got it, right? For now, let's say I will delete this pod here, I mean this information here. So now it will tell like, okay, I only have one pod into this worker node. Now scheduler will, what it will do, it will find first of all, okay, which pod have or which node have least or does not have a pod available. It will give this information. It will tell like, okay, this worker node has only one pod, it will store here. But what I need to have, I need to have here two pods, but it is having one pod. Controller, what it will do, it will go and then it will immediately, what it will do is, it will create another pod here, right? It will create another pod here like this. Okay, so that is the job of etcd, controller and scheduler. So etcd, controller and scheduler, everything is going to communicate with the API server only. Okay, now how API server is sending a request to kubelet, and what is happening here? Okay, so if we understand here in the worker node, there are three components again: kubelet, kubeproxy and pods. Pods can be n of n number. But what is this kubelet is doing? Okay, so kubelet is the main component here inside the worker node. Okay, and it helps to communicate with the master node. So any communication is happening here, communication with the worker and communication between worker and master nodes. So communication between worker and master nodes is happening between API server and kubelet. Okay, this can be asked in interviews, or if somebody is taking a junior level information, is asking some in a junior level interview, he can ask you, okay, how these two worker nodes communicate with the worker node or master node communicate with each other, and what are the component those two communicate helps to communicate. So what is the answer? API server and kubelet. So API server and kubelet helps to communicate between the worker node and master node. Okay, so what is this group kubeproxy here? What is this doing? So kubeproxy service runs on each node, each worker node, and helps in making service available for the end user. Okay, so as I told you, right, there is no communication going to happen inside a cluster directly between any cluster, any pod, any controller, any service, but the request will be, user will only share with API server. API server will communicate to kubelet. Kubelet will communicate to kube proxy, and it is a two-way communication here. So it will send the request here, and it user will be able to communicate to the worker node. So what it has, kube proxy will have IP address, load balancing information. So all those things, network communication can be done using kube proxy, right? What is the pod? Pod is the smallest unit inside the cluster, right? We can see, and inside the pod there can be multiple containers running into it. Okay, so this is the complete architecture we have for Kubernetes. I hope you are able to understand what is kube proxy, what is kubelet, what is API server, what is controller, scheduler, and etcd, and how the user is able to communicate with each other. Okay, so this is about the configuration, or this is about the architecture of Kubernetes. Now in the next video we are going to learn about the config file. Okay, so what is this config file and how this communication is happening? So those all information we will see in the upcoming video. Thank you. Have a great day.